Well, hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure as moderator to welcome today's guest discussant, Yun Sun, Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the East Asia Program and Director of the China Program at the Stimson Center. From 2011 to 2014, Ms. Sun was a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, where she focused on Chinese national security decision-making processes and China-Africa relations. From 2001 to 2011, she was the China analyst for the International Crisis Group, based in Beijing, specializing on China's foreign policy toward conflict countries and the developing world. An expert on US-Asia relations, Ms. Sun holds a master's degree in international policy and practice from George Washington University, as well as an MA in Asia-Pacific Studies and a BA in International Relations from the Foreign Affairs College in Beijing. Ms. Sun, we're indeed honored that you've accepted our invitation, and we extend to you the very warmest of welcomes. The floor is yours for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mike. And I should also mention in my biography, I'm also a proud resident of Reston. So when I received the invitation, I was like, well, I have to do it. That no matter what, I have to do it. I live in the South Lakes area, so I enjoy the Reston Library and the access to the library before the COVID tremendously. So it's really my pleasure to be here today and talk about basically what China wants and how China is getting it. That's how I frame my work to people who are not experts on foreign policy. That what does China want and why? What is the Chinese approach to the grand strategy to achieve its goal? First question: what does China want? The answer might depends on which Chinese leader we're talking about, because the current Chinese leader is apparently much more ambitious and much more aggressive compared to his predecessors. And his predecessors for 3 generations, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao, they followed the mantra of keeping a low profile and bide your time. And Xi Jinping makes a different decision. He comes into power in 2013, and he decides that maybe we have done enough biding. Maybe our low profile can be adjusted and adapted now that we are a stronger power. We're the number 2 power in the world. So this should afford China a little bit more flexibility in terms of flexing its muscle. But that's really a style problem. I call it the style of the foreign policy and what China wants to achieve. Because if you think about it, keeping a low profile by itself is not a goal. It's a process, it's a style, it's an approach that you're adopting. But the question is, what are you trying to achieve by keeping a low profile? You're trying to accumulate your strengths. Well, accumulate your strengths is also not a goal. What is the end goal of your accumulated strengths? So if you think about this, I think there is some truth to the argument that China does have a long game. And this long game started, you could say 40 years ago under Deng Xiaoping, or even longer, 60 years ago under Chairman Mao Zedong, that all these tactics, keeping a low profile, biding your time, they're all leading eventually to an end game where China aspires to, that's a question, aspires to what? And here's the interesting debate or interesting phenomena in the Chinese circle with the Chinese policy community on international relations. That China does not know what is international relations. Where China has never had the opportunity and the tradition or the exposure to international relations until modern China came into being in the 20th century. And why is that? Historically, when you look at China's history as China's nickname, Middle Kingdom, what does that mean? It means China sees itself as the center of the universe. And at least within the Asia neighborhood or the Asian region, which is China's immediate periphery, China has never encountered a power that would be equivalent or important and sizable enough to be China's peer. So throughout history, the only international system or the system of relations with other states that China had known is one where China was a hegemon. And there was no competition, there was no contest. There was occasional harassment or occasional disobedience from the tributary states or from the vassal states or from the provinces. But China as a middle kingdom has not really been challenged. And in that sense, if you think about the Chinese Confucianism, which dictates harmony, which dictates hierarchy, dictates that if you follow the social norms and follow the hierarchical order of the society, you're going to have harmony. If you think from that perspective, the reason that China has never experienced international relations until it opened up, the new China came into being in the 20th century, is because back in the days when China was a hegemon, there was no nations. Nation state is a relatively modern concept that came into being after the Westphalian Conference of 1648. Before that, we didn't have nations. We had territories, we had kingdoms, and at least in the Chinese case, we had a civilization. And China was using its cultural hegemony and its civilizational power to project its influence into the barbarians on China's periphery. But those were not nations. So the relations among nations, international, among nations relations, was never an experience that China had until 19th and 20th century. Which is why when China looks at the world today, and if you ask Xi Jinping that, well, what kind of international relations are you seeking, or what kind of world vision you are seeking? Unfortunately, the only one that China has ever known, and for 2,000 years, is one where China was a hegemon, and it was a hegemonic stability theory or hegemonic stability system that was dominated by China. And that's also what China instinctively wants to return to, even in today. That gets to the question, well, the world has changed. Apparently now we do have nation states, we do have boundaries, and we do have international norms and rules, and China has to follow them. So within the framework of those rules and those boundaries, what does China want from its neighbors? The key word here is deference. The Chinese will say that, well, look, historically, China was a celestial court, royal court on the heaven, and the other countries on the periphery, like Korea, like Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and Burma, those countries were regarded as barbarians, right? So a very chauvinistic view of the Chinese is that, well, China does not have any interest in getting involved in the domestic politics of the barbarians. Which means that coming to the domestic politics or domestic economy of these neighboring countries, the Chinese are not seeking to interfere. They're not interested in installing a leader of Burma that will be the puppet of Beijing. But what they do require, however, is that on issues that China sees as important, all these countries living under Chinese influence must pay China deference in terms of China's preferred position. And the most important example we're seeing is Taiwan. That if a country refuses to acknowledge the one China principle, which is different from our one China policy, then that country is immediately counted out or counted as a hostile force to the United States. To China. So that's basically what the Chinese are aspiring for. And the obstacle that they have encountered in their, the Chinese call the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation, and what I call the China returning to its rightful place in history. The two obstacles I have encountered, the first one is, well, now these days we do have nation states, we do have international relations, and we do have these norms that China has to respect. Well, I think that's why when China looks at the countries in Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, and even in South Asia, there is a sense of superiority. But on the other hand, there's also a sense of frustration that now these countries are treated as also as sovereign states. So morally, they are, or philosophically, they are the equals to China. But using the Chinese foreign minister, former Chinese foreign minister Yang Jiechi's words, word by word, in 2010 at the ASEAN summit in Hanoi, I think this chauvinism unfortunately just reveals itself. He said to the Southeast Asian nations that, well, China is a big power and you are all small. And that is a fact. And that really reminds people of the hegemonic narrative of the traditional Asian China had in the Asia region. That's the first obstacle. The second obstacle is the United States. as the external factor or the exogenous factor that is not endogenous to the traditional relations among nations or among states in Asia. The US has acted as an offshore balancer in Asia for a good of more than a century so far, subject to debate. I subject to the theory that the US has been an offshore balancer in Asia, trying to prevent the emergence of a superpower that could play a dominant role in the Eurasia continent. But some people have different views. But no matter what, US as an external player that is not endogenous to the Asia regional relations is seen by China as a critical factor that has changed the overall context of the Asia relations that China is trying to harness. And most importantly, US has allies and partners in the region. US has a value system that it's trying to promote in the region. And US has also played a significant role in terms of the security guarantee and the deterrence in the region in order to promote regional peace and stability. So as a result, what the Chinese instead has seen is that US as an external player is playing a disproportionate role in Asia that has become an obstacle for China's rise. And the best example here is South China Sea. US is insisting that while we have freedom of operation, freedom of navigation in the international sea lane of communications. The Chinese would say that, well, but this international sea lane of communication is within what we claim to be the zone of our historic rights. And US should not be able to conduct surveillance and reconnaissance in an area that is so close to the Chinese homeland. And when US works with countries in the region, including claimant countries like Vietnam and the Philippines, as well as, for example, collaboration with India and NATO countries, as well as Japan, for military exercise in the South China Sea in order to push back China's desire or China's action to dominate the South China Sea. So what the Chinese are seeing instead is US trying to align with countries and powers in the region to curtail and push back and contain China's rise. So how to deal with United States, especially in the West Pacific, in East Asia region, is the first primary or the most important challenge China encounters on its path to great power status. Or at least that's the Chinese view. If China cannot even push through the first island chain or to the second island chain, then China will never be the global superpower or even the regional superpower that China believes that it has always been and should always be. So that's why there is so much agony between US and China these days in terms of their interaction in West Pacific and who should, one, play the dominant role, and two, who should be the one that makes the rules as for what are the acceptable behaviors, what are the acceptable rules in the region. And that's why I think the Quad is regarded as particularly important, because this is one of the most distinct regional security framework that if it is successfully installed, will play a dominant role, will play a sustained role in the region to form an effective counterbalance to the hegemonic intention and hegemonic behavior of China. So with Quad, of course, there's a topic today. We have 4 countries. We have Australia, we have India, we have Japan, and we have the United States. And these 4 countries are different on many, many different levels. So within Quad, we always know that China still maintains probably the closest or the largest economic relations with all the Quad members. China is the largest trading partner with Japan, and China's trade with the United States last year, it was somewhere around $750 billion US. So China maintains such a close economic relationship with the Quad countries, which creates a dilemma for the Quad members, which is, well, with economic interdependence, it is just more difficult to fight a war or to have an oppositional or confrontational relationship without sacrificing or jeopardizing our economic interest. And we have seen this, for example, in the previous dispute between China and Japan. China was unofficially boycotting Japanese products, And China was also putting, for example, export of rare earth elements to Japan on hold, which created quite a panic in Japan because Japan, for its production of semiconductor chips, need these rare earth elements. So China does have economic capabilities that it can use as a coercive power. And in the case of Australia, we're seeing that China using Australian export to China as a hostage to basically force Australia to adopt a more pro-China position. So Quad, I would say that is probably the best and most feasible system that we can come up with in terms of coalescing with our regional allies and partners to build an effective deterrence and effective counterbalance against China. But this is not a perfect system. Well, there's no perfect system. Given China's trade relations and its status as a world factory, as a world economic powerhouse, that any policy that would be punitive to China is also going to invite the Chinese retaliation. And we're seeing this here in the United States, in Reston. We're seeing the rising cost, for example, of we're seeing the inflation, rising cost of imported items from China. And it raises basically a fundamental question for any administration, whoever is in charge of the White House, which is, well, there's always going to be a cost associated with a confrontational policy towards China. And is US consumer or are the US constituencies willing to carry those costs? So far, we have a bipartisan consensus that identifies China as the most consequential strategic challenge of the United States in the long term. Russia, in comparison, is merely, well, it's a near-term threat, it's an acute threat, it's an acute crisis, but China is a long-term strategic threat. So there's no perfect answer to the question as to how we deal with China, but each administration has their own policy designs as for what they believe is the most effective. And we can always compare notes in terms of what we believe is the best approach. So Mike, I think that will be my brief opening remarks, and I hope that will be my opening remarks to invite participants to share your views and make comments and potentially have a discussion. Thank you.
Well, indeed, those are excellent opening remarks. You've covered a lot of territory and you've established the parameters for our discussion. You meant, if I may, I'll claim the privilege of asking the first question. You mentioned China pushing through the various island chains. I wanted to ask you, what's up with the Solomon Islands? On April 20th, its prime minister announced that it had signed a security agreement with China, the full text of which has not been released. But apparently it allows China to send armed police and military personnel at the request of the Solomon Islands to assist in maintaining social order. There's a fear in the region that this might lead to the establishment of a Chinese base in the country. I think the US, Australia, New Zealand all seem to have been caught off guard. What are the implications of this development? Do you see it being a flashpoint?
I definitely see this being a flashpoint because, Mike, you used to work for State Department. My understanding is that Solomon Island is probably not among, but the most difficult country to travel to from Washington, D.C. 20 hours one way with 2 connections. So the fact that Kurt Campbell, who is the Indo-Pacific coordinator at the National Security Council, and Assistant Secretary of State Dan Christenbrink, took the trip to go to Solomon Island really attest to how much importance we are attaching to this development and to this specific country. So to give you basically a shortened version, the whole dispute with Solomon Islands started about 2 years ago when China stole Solomon Island from Taiwan. So before then, Solomon Island used to maintain diplomatic relations with Taiwan, with Republic of China. But because China wanted to punish the current government in Taiwan for not accepting the One China principle, they were taking away Taiwan's limited number of diplomatic allies during basically starting from 2017. And we saw a number of countries from 17 to 19. And Solomon Island was one of them. If you think about Solomon Island, it has a population of less than 1 million people. And the Chinese were basically offered deals and financing and infrastructure deals to the central government of Solomon Island, and in order to basically play the checkbook diplomacy, and basically still to make sure that Solomon Islands severs its diplomatic relations with Taiwan and establish diplomatic relations with China. However, Solomon Islands, like the name suggests, is composed of a chain of islands. And one of the largest island, I believe, is the name is Malaita.
Yes.
Used to maintain a very close relationship with Taiwan. That Taiwan had done very good collaboration economically, capacity building, social engagement with the local government and the local tribes in Malaita. So Malaita does not agree with this decision of severing diplomatic ties with Taiwan, and Malaita therefore became very opposed to Solomon Islands central government's desire to align closely with China, which was why that in November last year, there was a domestic riot in Solomon Island between the central government and the people and the political elites from Malaita. And that created the largest riot in Solomon Islands. That's unprecedented for the past history of the country. And Solomon Island requested assistance during that riot from both Australia and China to provide the stabilization operation or stabilization force during this riot. And both Australia and China sent the police force in order to achieve or reinstall the stability on the ground. And as a result of that arrangement, of that operation, when China and Solomon Islands were reaching their agreement this year, it was in one clause, one article was specifically included that upon the request of the government of Solomon Island, China would be sending civilian police, anti-riot police, security stabilization force to Solomon Island to help for the stabilization. That's how that article came into being. But it raised all kinds of questions because like my question to the Chinese, because the Chinese defense is that, well, we only agreed that we're going to send, send a police force upon the request of Solomon Island. We never said we're going to establish a fort or establish a military base on the territory. Well, my counter question or the counter argument is that, well, is your police force going to bring arms? Are they going to build a barrack? Where are they going to stay? So do you foresee a scenario where China will have to build military facilities on Solomon Islands in order to accommodate the security with this police force? And they agree that, yeah, we probably have to. So that's where it came into being. In terms of the deals between Solomon Island and China, it also includes construction of a port. And we all know that in terms of ports, depend on the technical specification, it could very possibly be dual use, which means that naval vessels, and in some cases, naval submarines can park at the port, can make port calls. And that will give China the foothold in the Pacific Island area that will basically afford China the ability to break away from the second island chain. So I think the concern is well justified. And at the minimum, we should be able to demand transparency in terms of what was agreed. But the essential problem lies in, at least in my view, the Chinese are always going to be hungry for this type of overseas facility. But the most critical link in this whole chain reaction or this whole story is Solomon Islands central government. That if the central government is acting against the people's will, so maybe there should be a different government. But at least so far, we know that the central government of Solomon Island is very keen on developing this relationship with China, and it does have tremendous military implications and the military potential. Hope that helps.
I think China is also constructing a giant stadium there for upcoming Pacific Games in 2023. And I think there's some talk about corruption or under the table money that's involved and things of that nature. We used to have an embassy there, which was closed and now is due to be reopened in the coming months. So finally, I guess we're getting around to taking the matter seriously. Adrian, are there any other questions out there for?
Yeah, the first one is from Mike. He said, very good description of Chinese mentality. You mentioned China's rights. Where do they believe those rights come from? A mandate from heaven? Why would they think anyone else does not have rights?
That's a very good question. I think it's like, well, where does China's legitimacy come from? Well, within China, the domestic politics, the Chinese argument, well, the Confucianism basically says that where do rights come from? It comes from the moral and material competence of players. It comes from the civilizational power. It comes from the fact that China was the only, well, they would like to believe that they were the only civilization in East Asia, so that all the other countries derived their culture from the Chinese civilization. Whether that is true or not, the Koreans do not agree, and the Vietnamese will not agree, and the Japanese certainly do not agree. But that is the Chinese view. They believe that their power comes, or their rights come from their superiority. It's like, well, the Destiny Manifesto. The Chinese have their own version of the Chinese Destiny Manifesto. They believe that they are the unique and unprecedented unique power in the Asia continent. And remember, before 18th century, China was the largest power and was the largest economy in the world. So I guess from that perspective, the Chinese will argue that, well, their power or their rights came from their superiority. And other countries also have power, but then again, if you are a realist, if you believe in realism, then might is right. At least the Chinese believe that they are realist, and they do believe that might is right. Not very appealing. I agree. If you are Japan, if you are Korea, you'll be like, that's not a country we want to live with, and that's not a country that we want to work with. But that's unfortunately that's the tragedy of geography, that these countries cannot move away, and they have to deal with economic interdependence with China, because let's not forget that China's market does have a 1.4 billion people. And that's a huge market, and huge market translates into huge leverage in terms of their behaviors. So I think that's why there is a extremely high welcoming attitude for the US to return to Asia, and for US to treat Asia as a priority, and to treat China as a long-term strategic adversary that China is, and work with countries in the region to counterbalance its hegemonic power.
Very comprehensive answer. Adrian, any other questions?
All right, thank you. Yes, Warren has his hand up. Warren, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. I'd like to know your view about, there are a growing number of economists today who predict that the Chinese economy will surpass that of the United States by 2030. I'd like to know your views about that. And if you do agree, do you think that the Chinese currency, renminbi, will take the place of the dollar in terms of international trade?
That's a great question. I think there are a couple of layers to this question. The first one is Chinese economy surpassing the United States by 2030. I think it has been predicted for a while, that depending on which measurement you use, like if you use PPP measurement, then some economists would say that Chinese economy has already surpassed the United States. But with the Chinese economy, there's always a caveat, and we debate this quite vigorously with the Chinese. That, well, how dare you call yourself still a developing country? You have the largest economy in the world. How can you still ask for example, World Bank aid to pay for infrastructure projects in China? That you are already so rich, so wealthy, and the Chinese always defeat us with one word, or maybe two words, per capita. That because China has 1.4 billion people, that no matter how large the GDP is, once you divide it by 1.4 billion, it becomes relatively small. So you can look at China as a large economy, a wealthy economy, but it does not necessarily mean that the Chinese people are rich. or the overwhelming majority of the Chinese people are rich. There are the rich few, especially in the large cities and urban areas, but the economic development is still extremely unbalanced. And the Gini coefficient in China has been worsening since 20 years ago. So it means that just like any great powers, the great power, that image does not cover up the fact that there's a lot of economic problems, injustice, and imbalance internally. So that's the first comment I would like to make. And secondly, the comment is, does China as largest economy equate to China as the superpower? And that gets into the definition of comprehensive national power, right? I think Mike knows this, the 7 indicators that we use to measure comprehensive national power: damn field, diplomatic, economic, military, financial, informational, and then field, intelligence, and intelligence, informational, and L is labor, so human resources. So if you use the judgment to look at China's comprehensive national power, you will find out that China is really just only strong in the financial aspect. Their diplomatic power is pretty weak. If you think about the warrior diplomats, the diplomats are supposed to have the power of persuasion, not the power of coercion. That's reserved for the military, right? So diplomatic, not really a strong power. Military, their defense spending is climbing up. Now it's about 25 to 30% of the defense budget of the United States annually, and they're still trying to play catch up. But I would say that the Chinese military capacity is regarded as inferior, at least by 20 to 30 years to the United States. One, because of the internal structures that's being reformed. Two, because of the technological advancement of the PLA is not as fast as people think it is. And three, because they still have the national unification agenda to achieve before they can claim to be a great military power in the region. So for China, that's why some people argue that for China to become a great power, the first hurdle they have to overcome is the issue of Taiwan. And the issue of Taiwan still has the US intervention potentially, and also the potentially intervention from Japan, from South Korea. So even for that national unification agenda, Chinese military is not yet able to achieve it. I always tell people that the only reason that China does not use force is because China doesn't know that they can win. And that's the most effective deterrence against the Chinese use of force against Taiwan. So I think the second point I'm trying to make is that being the largest economy does not mean that China is a superpower. In fact, that China is still lagged behind on many different aspects that as a comprehensive great power. And last, on the issue of the Chinese currency, I think it's the same. It's a similar story to the second point I was making. That yes, in recent years we are seeing the regionalization or the internationalization of RMB, and the Chinese government is vigorously pushing for that agenda because they do know that a dollar-dominated system is not going to be in China's favor in the long run. If they want to become the superpower, they will want to make RMB an international transaction currency. But the problem is, China wants to, but other countries may not want to, right? So when China tells other countries that, well, we want to use RMB as a transaction currency, that you will have to pay us RMB and we will give you RMB, other countries do not comply. And this is why the examples that I used to that I like to cite is between China and Russia. You would think that these are two countries that have vigorously tried to undermine the United States and try to undermine the dollar status in the international financial system. Between China and Russia, their total trade in 2021 was $147 billion US, and within that $147 billion, only 17% was transactions using their local currency, using rubles and RMB. And I think 24% of their trade is conducted in euro. And then about, I think it was 20 to 23% that's conducted in US dollars. So I would say that yes, internationalization of RMB is a glorious mission that China wants to achieve, but so far it has not been terribly successful. And one of the most important reasons is because China is still an authoritarian state, right? So the foreign exchange rate of the Chinese currency is still very effectively manipulated by the Chinese government. So that raises a lot of risks for trading partners of China. If they do decide to use RMB for transaction, what if someday Beijing wakes up and decides that, well, actually we need to depreciate our RMB by say 30%. And then it means that the foreign reserve held by other countries in the form of RMB will also depreciate by 30%. So I would say that in this case, the authoritarian nature of the Chinese government plays a big disservice for their desire to internationalize RMB. And once in a while, we see some countries, like most recently, Saudi threatened, well, because Saudi is so pissed off with the United States, Saudi Arabia said, well, we're going to consider RMB for transaction currency for our crude oil trade with China. Well, it's not impossible, but I would be shocked if they conduct all their trade in Chinese currency, because that's simply not the most secure way to have your foreign reserves. I hope that helps. Thank you so much for your question.
Thank you.
Interesting, you mentioned the 2030 goal of China surpassing the US. I was reading today in the Washington Post that the IMF has lowered the growth forecast for China for this year to 4.4%, and that some analysts think that the growth will even not attain that. It might be even slower. And there's now, some people are speculating that China may not surpass the US by the end of the decade. It may not for some time to come. So it seems to be a question that's floating out there for final decision. Adrian, any other questions?
There's one that asks, India has abstained from criticizing Russia over its Ukraine invasion. Meanwhile, the majority of Indians appear to believe that U.S. provoked Russia into attacking its neighbor. This does not seem to bode well for Quad unity. Is India an uncertain Quad partner?
That is a great question. First, I just want to make a comment about what Mike just said about the China may not surpass the United States. I think that's a possibility, and that's a very lively possibility, because we know that as China's economy grows, and also the Chinese elite politics comes to a stalemate, China cannot maintain the double-digit growth rate forever, right? It has to slow down at some point, and as the economy grows bigger, the ability to generate growth is also much more more and more difficult. But in terms of the competition between US and China, I think it also depends on how competitive the US economy will be. And we have vowed that we're going to invest in our infrastructure, invest in our STEM studies domestically. We're going to stimulate the innovation here in the United States in order to compete effectively with China. And I think all those are right directions to go. But the Chinese have one advantage, which is that, well, their economy is dominated by the state. And the state can allocate resources, both financial resources and human resources, into the direction that they want to see advanced. So this is something that I find that is very difficult to compete with the Chinese system, because they do have a whole of a nation approach coming to specific areas with specific industries that they're trying to promote. And in the United States, we're more based on capitalist economy, based on private sector innovation. So I guess you could also argue that private sector innovation is much more, the motivation is much stronger than a state-dominated approach. Well, we'll see how that comes about. So that is just to say that I think in terms of this economic competition, it's not just about how ineffective the Chinese system is, but it's also about how effective the US system can be. On the issue of India, I think the Indian position is that the reason that India joins Quad is not because of Russia, it's because of China. So regardless of India's position on Russia, India and the United States still share the common threat perception about China. So I think the Indian would like to see a scenario where they are given some flexibility and some accommodation in terms of their position on Russia, but on the issue of China, they don't have a second thought. So on China, India sees itself as a solid and irreversible partner of the United States, and they believe that's what Quad is all about. Because if you think about it, Quad is in the Indo-Pacific region. It's not about Russia per se. NATO is about Russia, but Quad is about China. So therefore, as long as India and the United States still share this common threat perception about China, I think there is a very strong ground for us to push this relationship forward. Whether India's ambivalence on the issue of Russia deserves punishment from the United States, I think that's a separate issue. But if you think about India's reality, 70% of India's international arms purchase comes from Russia, which means that Indian military systems, we have offered Indian defense cooperation. We offered to enhance interoperability between the US, the American military and the Indian military. But the problem is Indian system has always been a Russia-dominated system. Their weapon system, their internal management, their command structure. So it's very difficult to promote interoperability between the US system and the Russia-dominated Indian system. So unless and until that we can really reduce India's defense and military dependence and integration with Russia, I think for us to argue that while India should just abandon Russia and come work with the United States, that's a little bit of a wishful thinking on our part, and without taking into consideration the reality that India is facing. But this could change down the road. Well, first off, looking at Russia's military and Russia's military the defense production capability, we know that Russia is running low on semiconductor chips, and even for some of their weapon system, the Russians are running low on those chips. And what it means that the Russian ability to produce and export their arms, their weapon systems, as well as before, is significantly affected or significantly undermined. So will Russia continue to be India's largest arms supplier after the war in Ukraine? And that's the first factor. The second factor is by the end of the war in Ukraine, Russia is going to be so weakened and isolated that it will not have international partners for financing, for financial resources, for economic assistance, for trade. China, unfortunately, will pretty much be the only one left, or the only consequential player left on Russia's external trade or external economic relations. It means that China will have significant leverage over Russian decision-making. And recall that China and India are not having the best relationship in the world. In fact, I would say that they're probably having the worst relationship since their diplomatic normalization, short of the 1962 Sino-India border war. And what this means is that if China is able to manipulate Russia's decision-making, and then the Indians' ability to depend on Russia for defense supplies and for military weapon systems is probably going to be affected as well. So those are the independent variables that will determine India's future relationship with Russia. But it's still coming to Quad, like I mentioned, is the target is China. The target is not Russia. And that target on China has not changed between India and the United States. Thank you.
Adrian, anyone else in queue?
Mike has another question. Most economic crises are caused by real estate speculation. China has that problem now. How would that affect China if there's a collapse of banks due to that?
That's a great question. And I think we have, for economists, the issue of China's bad debts. I feel that it comes up every year, if not every other year, that we suspect that there's a housing bubble, the real estate industry is going to collapse. We see all these ghost cities in second tier and third tier cities in China, and it creates tremendous national worries about what this means. I think that's a very legitimate concern, and that's why the Chinese government has been trying to achieve what they call the soft landing. Basically, in the past 5 to 10 years, that they're aiming for a soft landing to gradually squeeze the housing bubble out of the economy, But then, of course, we had COVID, and the situation does not improve. Although I would say that in 2020, China was the only country in the world that was able to achieve positive economic growth, while basically the rest of the world was in recession. So coming to China's ability or its bad debt, I think it depends on which data you look at. If you look at China's foreign reserve, China still has the largest foreign reserve in the whole world. And if I remember correctly from my reading last week, China's foreign reserve is 4.5 trillion US dollars. So that can buy them some time and some space in terms of their domestic real estate industry. Real estate industry in China is also seen as, or at least in the past decade, it was seen as an economic growth point, because once you want to build real estate, you are boosting all these industries, like the building material, like the contractors, like the real estate companies. It creates a huge GDP boost for the domestic economy. So I think in the past, the Chinese economy has been, the term I use is addicted to the real estate boom and the GDP created by the real estate industry. Like the joking or the famous quote in China, the story in China is that, well, if you operate a factory in China, a mid-sized factory, your profit for the whole year may not be more than, say, 2 million US dollars. But if you purchase real estate in China, within 2 years, you could make much more than that. So that really shows you the problem with the Chinese economy is that it's so focused on the real estate industry that the actual industries, the manufacturing industries, the backbone of the economy is not getting the resources and the attention that it needs. But still, it doesn't mean that people always talk about what China is going to collapse, China is going to fall, and they just have a difficult time trying to imagine what that looks like. That given the fact that Chinese government has the largest foreign reserve, and given the fact that the Chinese government has total monopoly of its domestic economic decision-making, and remember that oppositions or different views are not really, well, when the Chinese Communist Party puts its mind to it, oppositions from the industry or from the market is not going to amount to much. Look at what happened to Jack Ma, for example, that basically as the most powerful businessman in China, when the party decides to wipe him out, he is wiped out. So in that policy environment, I feel that the government does enjoy quite a big leeway in terms of their policy options. And I personally do not, I do not believe in the collapse scenario, because in that policy environment, it's just very difficult to, well, they will limp on and there will be troubles and there will be problems. But hey, well, here, well, we live in the United States. We know the economic decision-making is full of challenges and there's always problems. But with China, it's a different set of problems. But they also have different approaches to deal with those problems. So thank you. Sorry, it's not a terribly pessimistic or look from me.
Adrian?
Yeah, I know that you only have a few minutes left, but maybe we can squeeze one more in. In his book, U.S. Strategy in the Asian Century, Abraham Denmark argues that the U.S. must, while adapting its Indo-Pacific policy, gives equal weight to convincing China that the preservation of an existing global order is in its favor. Denmark says China will show support for the system if it believes the mechanism is in its interest, such as non-proliferation. Do you agree with Denmark, or is something rotten here?
No, I like Abe. I feel that he's very sharp, and he worked at DOD. So I feel that people from DOD always have the very cut through the chase and bottom line thinking, which I really like. I think this is the debate that we have seen in the China policy community for the good past 10, 20 years about China, which is, should we accommodate or should we contain? And if we accommodate, how much should we accommodate? If we contain, can we really be successful? And I don't believe there is a consensus as for what the answer should look like. But I will give you a few examples. Like if we want to accommodate China, China says, well, we are the biggest power in Asia. US is allowed, US is welcome to come to Asia, but if you are in Asia, you must obey the rules made by the Asians. Is that a position that's acceptable for the United States? And the most bottom line issue coming to international system or the international order, the Chinese love the international order for the parts that China gets the benefits. Like, for example, UNP5. China is one of the members of the UN Security Council, the permanent members of the UN Security Council. It's one of the 5 nuclear powers. So those status give China tremendous leeway and give China tremendous prestige. And China enjoys that. The last thing China will want to see is a reform of UN that takes away or dilute China's special privilege as a P5 member of the Security Council. So there are those aspects in the international relations that the Chinese do not want to see revised. But there are also those parts that China wants to see revised. Like, for example, international order, like the liberal international order, we say there are 3 components to it: that Western democracy, liberal democracy, free trade in terms of international economic relations, and the capitalist economy coming to domestic economy. So the Chinese would say that, well, yeah, well, this is your definition of international order, but we don't believe in Western democracy. And we do not accept that it has to be a universal value. And we don't believe that it should be the prevailing norm, the political philosophy in China. So do we accommodate that? When China says that we have our unique history, we are authoritarian, probably so, and we are going to stick to our authoritarian path for the foreseeable future, do we find that acceptable? Can we accommodate those positions? So I feel that there's no perfect answer to this question. And it's not binary. It's not either we accommodate nor we contain. I feel that the answer in the end is going to be something that is combination of the two. And here, coming to the issue of I would just want to make one comment about US-China great power competition, and this concept of the new Cold War and where US and China is going. There is a conviction in China that this competition is going to escalate. And it will escalate to a dangerous level. Like on Taiwan, the Chinese are threatening use of force, and there potentially could be a military scenario. And the Chinese believe that ground rules will only be made when the 2 countries come to the brink of war. And that's exactly what happened during the Cold War. And Mike will know this much better than I do, that between US and the Soviet Union, it really takes several rounds of confrontation coming to the brink of war, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, including the U-2 incident, for US and Russia and Soviets to really come to the negotiation table and negotiate and mutually accepted rules of engagement. But between US and China, we're not there yet. We're still in this escalation stage, in this struggling stage, that we have not come to the brink of a war, and it has not come to the 2 powers that with a sober understanding that we need to settle, we need to stabilize, and we need to find a common existence, a path forward. So in that sense, I don't disagree with Abe. I feel that he is arguing for one school of the thought about how to deal with China, which is to basically to reform China and change China and make China see the current international order as acceptable for China. It might happen, but probably not during this current Chinese president who has declared that, well, we never agreed that we would change as a result of the US engagement of China, right? So yeah, so that's my assessment of the current situation, but it does not preclude the future possibility that China would be changed.
Your thoughts coincide with those, I think, of former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. He's just published a new book, The Avoidable War, The Dangers of Catastrophic Conflict Between the US, in which he maintains that the 2 countries that are at high risk of military conflict because they haven't established guardrails for how to responsibly conduct their strategic competition. And that is of concern. I mean, it makes one worry that we could be on the verge of something because we just are talking past one another, or perhaps we're not talking enough.
Yeah, well, I wonder about this because between US and China, the people used to say that, well, we have problems because we don't understand each other. We need to talk more. And then we talked for 40 years and we realized we still don't like what we saw. And the more we talk and the more we don't like it. I think that's unfortunately where we are today. So if talking and understanding of each other's position, like what I explained to be China's mentality coming to international relations, that mentality almost has no market, has no appetite here in the United States to accept it. And what it means that better understanding may not be the best thing in the world because we may not like what we see. So what it means is I still believe that guardrails will be established, will be developed, but only after the two countries realize how dangerous their current interaction pattern is. And why guardrails is necessary for them not to run into a disastrous scenario. But unfortunately, it will take that disastrous scenario for us to come to realize that we need to prevent it. Currently, both countries are conducting what I call the salami slicing. Both countries are pushing. We're pushing on Taiwan, and the Chinese are pushing on, for example, Solomon Island and the economic coercion of its neighbors. So we're both pushing, and both countries feel that, well, we need to push more before we negotiate, right? What you cannot achieve on the battlefield, you're not going to achieve on the negotiation table. So that's where we are.
It's not the time then for more wolf warriors, I guess, right?
I think wolf warriors are serving, or at least the wolf warrior diplomats are serving more of a domestic political purpose rather than foreign policy. In terms of foreign policy, they're terrible. They're doing China so much damage. But domestically, being the wolf warrior diplomat gains you political favors from the leader. And leader says, "Oh, look at that young guy. He has backbones. He's bold, and we like it." So it's more of a domestic political career advancement strategy rather than a foreign strategy, I would say.
Well, heavens, your presentation today has been nothing short of top rate, and it's just fantastic. And we realize that we're running on to 3 o'clock here and you have something else you have to get off to, but I would be most remiss if I didn't thank you from the bottom of our hearts for agreeing to be with us for this all too brief 1 hour. You've given us so much to think about, and you've been so articulate on this issue. It's really been very enlightening, and we thank you sincerely.
Thank you so much,
Ms. Sun.
Mike. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you for having me, and see you around in Reston.
Yeah.
Bye. Have a good summer. Bye bye.
See you at 5 tomorrow. It's closing, their last day.
Okay. All right. Bye for now.
Okay, for everybody who wasn't able to watch the entire Foreign Policy Association video, again, I apologize that for the goof up there, I wasn't able to admit people until about halfway through. For anybody who's able to stick around for another half hour or so, I'm going to play it again.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions 2022. Today, we tackle topic number 6, the Quad Alliance. 1 week ago, we looked at Myanmar and ASEAN, a regional alliance. The Quad Alliance is significantly broader and involves more significant powers. This graph shows us the 4 countries involved in the Quad Alliance: the United States, Japan, India, and Australia. 3 main considerations before we consider U.S. foreign policy options. We first address the issue of the Quad Alliance, exactly what it is and it is intended for. We consider strategic alliances in general, and then look at America's pivot towards Asia. We start with the Quad Alliance. Returning to that earlier graph, these 4 countries forming an alliance with a very clear target, which is the People's Republic of China. And as China continuously makes claims to the South China Sea, the role of the Quad Alliance could be enhanced. China's military spending, as you can see from this graph, has escalated dramatically over the course of the past 2 decades, reaching levels that are almost unparalleled in world politics. Of course, the United States remains the dominant military spending power in the world, many times larger a budget for its defense procurements. We have been warned by our own military that China's progress is stunning, and at the same time reflecting upon many of the traditional problems that have caused the United States to lag behind in terms of efficient spending and global force projection, most notably a brutal military bureaucracy. Back to the Quad Alliance, let's look at the United States as it relates to China in terms of power and projection. If we were to note the areas of the Pacific where the United States enjoys a clear geostrategic and military advantage, it would be the vast majority of the ocean. After World War II, this blue area would have extended all the way to the perimeter of China and Southeast Asia. Because of China's increased military spending, its decision to be more global as a military power, and its claims to the South China Sea, it now enjoys something of an advantage in its own neighborhood. Without doubt, the U.S. Navy is thoroughly more impressive than the Chinese Navy. However, our Navy is dispersed all over the globe, while China's is largely concentrated in one area, giving it something of an advantage. The Quad Alliance is designed to counter China's increased presence in Southeast Asia and the South China Sea. How does one maintain an advantage when another country is growing militarily? There are options. One is to increase your own military spending. Certainly the United States could do that. However, our yawning national debt, our increased internal demands for balancing a budget make it rather difficult for the U.S. to spend any more than it currently is as it relates to China. That was our policy during the Cold War. We had a very clear idea that if we could outspend the Russians, they would eventually economically implode, which is exactly what happened. Option number 2 is to form an alliance, to join forces with other countries so that your collective military capabilities continue to dominate the rising power. That has been our approach with the Chinese. And the Quad Alliance is another example of U.S. alliance forming with Beijing in mind. Here you can see, again, the flags of the 4 Quad countries with the very clear underlying intent of countering China's influence, not only in the South China Sea, but far beyond that. By the numbers, the 4 Quad nations make up almost 1/4 of the world's population, over 1/4 of the world's economy, and nearly half of the world's military spending. This is a powerful set of 4 nation states. Recently, there was a Quad joint naval exercise that happened in the Indian Ocean, something that raised flags in China and led to a stern Chinese rebuke. Here we can see China's string of pearls strategy. This is the effort by China to create ports of call all along the coastline in Southeast and South Asia, all the way to the edges of the Middle East. The Quad joint military activity took place in the Bay of Bengal, right at the heart of China's string of pearls map. We were sending the message to China that we're not going to simply sit back and allow you to grow militarily in terms of your global footprint and influence without a counter response from Washington. Here we can see an image of Mr. Biden's White House summit with the Quad leaders, discussing overall strategy, with the underlying theme being the ability to counter Chinese influence. So what was placed on the formal agenda of the Quad summit? COVID, infrastructure development, climate change initiatives, outer space, one of our 2022 great decisions, people-to-people exchanges, critical tech areas where cooperation would be essential, and combating cyber security. These are all very important issues to all of the Quad Alliance members. Let's now take a look at strategic alliances. There is a nature to them. Anytime that you see a military alliance, we look at the membership to get an idea of the character, the geographic location, and possibly some insights into what that alliance is designed for. There should be some common defining principles among those members that make the alliance logical and long-standing. And then finally, an underlying raison d'etre or reason for being. Why was the alliance created in the first place, and what is its mission? As we saw with ASEAN in the previous lecture, the raison d'etre of an alliance does change. It was created in the 1960s to counter Vietnam. It morphed into a counter-China alliance in the 1990s. NATO similarly has changed dramatically, but in its origins, the members of NATO were Western allies following World War II with a number of common domestic principles, such as commitment to democracy, promotion of human rights, and a commitment to global trade. The underlying reason, of course, for NATO was to deter the Soviet Union from invading Central or Western Europe, such that an invasion against any NATO member would be legally construed as an invasion or an attack on all NATO members. NATO is viewed as the single most impressive and successful military alliance in human history. It has lasted since its establishment in 1949. One of its members was attacked by an outside party for the first time in 2001 with the 9/11 World Trade Center and Washington, D.C. terror strikes. NATO did respond with a joint invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. That was the first time that the key operative article of NATO was employed. NATO versus the Quad Alliance. Let's do a bit of a comparison. NATO was designed for immediate survival. Draw a very clear, bright line along the eastern edge of NATO members, or in the case of Turkey and Greece, a northern bright line. The Soviets could never cross it. Containing the Soviet Union physically was the principal aim of NATO, which of course includes deterring it from attacking a NATO member. The Quad Alliance, on the other hand, is more about positioning in the long term. There is not an immediate threat to any one of the four members of the Quad Alliance. No one is gaming out a Chinese invasion of Japan or the United States because it simply is so unlikely. Countering China is the long-term plan, not containing it. Containment requires complete success at all times. Countering simply means positioning and repositioning to blunt the influence of China in its quest for global influence. With the Soviet Union, there was a very clear record of invading neighbors and establishing puppet governments. With China, however, there's no record of invasion. China's not been at war since 1979, when it briefly invaded Vietnam and was taught a stern lesson for it. No, China's historical record is one of investment and trade. That is not something that can be contained. It can only be countered. Let's compare the Soviet Union, the focus of NATO, with China, which is the focus of the Quad Alliance. We should not treat them as the same. Yes, they were both communist powers at the time of their threat. The Soviet Union during the Cold War, China to this day, at least in name. They're both rising major powers. They're both land powers. Beyond that, the threat is quite different. For the Soviet Union, we never considered it to be a legitimate country. Moscow complained about this continuously during the Cold War, that American diplomats and American presidents believed the Soviet Union and its Communist Party were illegitimate. We've not said that about China. Since we shifted from recognizing Taiwan, the Republic of China, to recognizing mainland China, the People's Republic of China, we've always considered it to be a legitimate power. The Soviet Union rejected American global leadership. Its military posture and spending were designed to keep it on par with the U.S. militarily and geostrategically, to maintain a bipolar world and to deny the United States a claim of global leadership and hegemony. To date, the Chinese have accepted American global leadership. Part of the reason for the difference here is that the Soviets realized that the liberal international economic order, that is the free trade system, announced in 1944 at Bretton Woods and installed globally, ran counter to its economic policies, while the Chinese, especially since the death of Mao Zedong, have gotten rich on the trading system that we've established and largely underwritten. The Soviet Union died grasping its Marxist beliefs and tenets. Even Gorbachev remained a communist to the very end, whereas the Chinese have largely abandoned Marxist orthodoxy, ideology, and tenets, instead being much more practical, pragmatic, and even a global trading power. For the Soviets, when they wanted an ally in the world, there was a very clear communist ideology test. When a nation raised the Marxist-Leninist flag, it was signaling to Moscow, we want to be your ally. You are free to ship us your money and your weaponry. China, on the other hand, has no such litmus test. It doesn't matter to China if you're a capitalist or non-capitalist country, democracy or authoritarian, large or small, even location doesn't seem to matter for China. They look for things, notably economic opportunity, energy resources, and future favorable votes in international organizations, but there's no ideological litmus test for China when it seeks allies across the global system. The Soviet Union had a military-centric aid policy to allies, providing them with weaponry. For China, it is an economic-centric relationship that it establishes. The Soviets fought proxy wars with the United States in places like Korea in the 1950s, Vietnam in the 60s and 70s and beyond, while the Chinese largely refrain from military confrontation either with the United States or with our allies. China is much more careful in its international interactions than the Soviet Union was during the Cold War. The Soviet Union was crippled by its economic and political system, while the Chinese have been propelled forward by their own. Minimal trade between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, especially before détente. Kissinger obviously changed that, seeking inroads to Moscow for purposes of pursuing arms control accords. We've had maximum trade with the Chinese. And what that means is that during the Cold War, as we confronted the Soviets, not only could we militarily spin them into the grave, we could also economically sanction them without hurting us back home. China, however, because of the volume of trade, it means sanctions, tariffs, and quotas will have a very high cost for the United States. Here we can see the old Cold War map, the Soviet Union and its allies in Eastern Europe, the United States, of course, with its allies in blue on the left-hand side. If the Soviet Union crossed that line, invaded a blue region, a NATO member, the red balloon went up, as they say in the military, and the U.S. would be at war. How, however, do you draw bright lines as it relates to China and its global economic trading practices? Here you can see the Silk Road or Belt Road Initiative has had many different terms, and the label that China uses varies depending on the region because the translation does have different implications. But as you can see, by land and by sea, China is reaching out into the world, building infrastructure, highways, byways, rail systems, seaports, airports, and in so doing, it's very difficult for the U.S. to draw a line and say, don't invest here. I mean, they've even reached Western Europe and NATO allies with Chinese investment projects. So the question is, where does one begin to counter the adversary, the rival? For the Soviet Union, it was pretty easy. It's the divide between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. But if we're going to go after them and try to undermine them, that's called a rollback policy. The question remains, where exactly do you go on the offensive? Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s focused on Eastern Europe. He said to them through America's liberation policy, if you rebel, we're there with you. We will support you and stand by you. And we saw rebellions happen in Hungary in the 1950s and Czechoslovakia in the 1960s. With each of those, the United States said, we're with you verbally, but nothing more. That was the Soviet sphere of influence. We could not go across that line. Mr. Reagan in the 1980s revised the rollback policy by focusing on the weak outposts, places like Nicaragua, the Horn of Africa, and even Southeast Asia, forcing the Soviet Union to spend more of its dwindling resources protecting its outposts, as Brezhnev called them, its far-flung allies. That was a much more successful policy and a much less dangerous one than challenging the Soviets in their own backyard. With China, it's borderline impossible to find a place to counter effectively. What exactly are we going to say to countries in the Caribbean? Stop taking Chinese loans? Especially since we're not prepared to replace those Chinese loans. Don't misunderstand me. Many, if not most of the countries that borrow money from China grow to regret it. They realize the terms are not that favorable. The infrastructure project doesn't pay the dividends that they had anticipated, but by then it is too late. And as noted earlier, now China is even reaching into the European Union and NATO for its investment projects. It's just a very different rival for us to counter than was the Soviet Union during the Cold War era. It's a deal that's too good to turn down, and very few countries do turn it down. So the Quad Alliance, in many ways, is a default strategy. We cannot head off Chinese investments abroad, even in our allied regions of Europe, so let's form a geostrategic alliance that boxes China in militarily. Here we can see an image of the Quad Alliance meeting. This is actually a portion of the alliance because the United Kingdom is not a member. It is Mr. Biden on the right and the Australian head of government in the center, and they are announcing a new nuclear submarine deal. This made headlines across the globe, but especially in France, because France had an existing multi-billion-dollar deal with Australia for diesel-powered submarines. That was ditched in favor of the more obviously impressive one offered by the U.S. and the United Kingdom. This tells us that the U.S. is beginning to prioritize the Quad Alliance over individual bilateral relations, even with NATO allies. How about this pivot that's happening to Asia? This is certainly a major force that's led to the Quad Alliance. The question is why? Why are we going to the eastern portion of Asia in particular? Well, there's some obvious reasons. The new center of power is there. China is an emerging global power. It's located in Asia. Let's focus our attention there. Shifting away from the modest policies of trying to rebuild nations like Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan, and instead focusing upon big picture issues like who is the dominant power in the world and how can we learn to live with and work with the Chinese. Our failures in Central and Western Asia, we've been burned very badly in the Middle East in particular, and the edges of that region. We should try a different area of the world. And finally, the economic opportunity that is there. There are some significant and growing economies in Asia China, India, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, it's logical from an economic point of view to spend our foreign policy energy working on policies oriented towards the Pacific and the Asian continent. And I don't mean all of Asia, of course, when I talk about the pivot there. Asia is a very large and diverse continent, many countries, very large portion of the global population, as we saw in an earlier lecture in this series. There is the portion of Asia that's part of the Middle East, ranging from Turkey to Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. There is South Asia, which is dominated by India and Pakistan. There is Central Asia, which is the stands of the world. There is Southeast Asia, which we looked at recently. When we talk about the pivot to Asia, we probably draw the line about here. India and China to the east, including Southeast Asia and the Pacific Rim. That's where the power, the population, military spending, and economies can be found. Nearly half of the world's population resides in that part of Asia to the right of this yellow line. All right, we've taken a look now at the three considerations. Let's consider U.S. foreign policy. Strategies to deal with China range on the spectrum from a soft line to a hard line approach. Playing the long game is the soft line. This means a lot of confidence that in the end we're better off than China and we will prevail as the rules are currently written and as the global system is arranged. The hardline side, we have the neoconservative or neocon strategy. The long game, priority on trade and profit, with the underlying assumption that as the Chinese become wealthier and more invested, they'll be less likely to challenge the U.S. as the top country in the geostrategic pyramid. It makes a lot of sense because the wealthier you are and the more you trade, especially with other rivals, the higher the cost of military engagement with them. The neoconservative strategy is very different. It begins with the premise that the U.S. is the dominant geostrategic, military, political, economic power of the world, and any nation state, communist or non, ally or enemy, long history or short one, any country that's rising is a threat to the United States and must be dealt with immediately. We often associate the neocon strategy with Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as Libya under the Obama administration. Most of the neocons, of course, were found in the George W. Bush administration. And that was a strategy of toppling dictators and promoting democracy. That's a different part of the neocon strategy. The traditional approach is to tamp down on any rising power, and that would mean confrontation with China. There are, of course, plenty of options in between, including a counterbalancing strategy, which is what we see with the Quad Alliance. Why it makes sense. If the U.S. seeks to separate from China, finding key allies around China makes a lot of sense. It's logical. Creating an alliance with these four countries passes the eyeball test as we look at a map of Asia and the Pacific. Disentangling our trade and supply chain lines requires finding new allies in that region where labor is competitive, and we can find other sources of many of the products that we consume as a nation. And then finally, add both South Korea and Vietnam to the Quad Alliance. There have been some talk of this, maybe as associate members, if not full members of the Quad Alliance. If you were to ask me which of these two countries impresses me most today and into the future, without hesitation, I'm going to say the United States. This is the global power of the 21st century. We are hampered largely by internal variables. We're shooting ourselves in the foot politically. We have two political parties that are borderline dysfunctional, a Democratic Party that is so diverse that is so divided it has a hard time unifying, and a Republican Party that is loyal to one personality. These are not healthy trends on either side of the political line, but they're manageable if the two parties could work together. But as you will note in 2022, there's virtually no bipartisan agreement in Washington, D.C., and that means it's very difficult for the United States to move forward in the most optimal fashion. China is advantaged domestically. It is a dictatorship. One voice makes a decision for all, but there are so many deficits in China, geographically, geostrategically, and demographically. Those three key variables that we use to project where a country will be in 30, 50, or 80 years, they're not very positive for China. And as it continues to reach out into the world, there will be natural counterbalances against it, not just the Quad Alliance, but by local and regional powers. There will be a resistance movement emerging against China in those areas. So if I'm going to place a bet on which country does best this century, no doubt it's the United States. Thank you for attending this lecture. Do stay engaged and make great decisions.